So perhaps some of you are like me in that some weekends I walk in here and the week has asked so much of me that I don't know what else I can give. But one thing God has been teaching me is that He does not intend for me to live out of scarcity. So last fall, I was determined that it would be the year when I would miraculously learn how to bake an apple pie. And I wanted the best apples ever, so my husband and I loaded up our toddlers and headed to the orchard. We took our time, we were deliberate. We looked over every apple, making sure that only the most beautiful, the most perfect ones made it into our basket. I was taking this pie-making business seriously. As soon as we got home, the apples became the most prized possession in our house. Everybody wanted one, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And as our pile of apples dwindled, I saw my pie dreams fading. So I started rationing and stockpiling, pulling out the best ones and hiding them away from myself. When the kids would beg for apples, I'd warn them, yes, but just one. One morning, my daughter begged me for an apple, and I leaned down to her and said, no, baby, we have to save the rest for something really special. And I stopped. When did I decide that my daughter's dimpled smile when she bit into one wasn't special enough? Just a few days earlier, we'd walked through an entire orchard full of apples, more than any of us could count, and yet there I was, teaching my kids that if something is good and beautiful, it has to be rationed and withheld and earned. The Bible tells the story of a woman who lost her husband, who was doing her best to care for her 2 sons. But the little she had dwindled day by day until all she had left was a small jar of oil. Then came a knock at the door. There were debts to be paid. If she couldn't find a way to repay them, her 2 boys would be taken as slaves. Desperate, she went to see the prophet Elisha. He asked her what she had in her house, and her quick answer was nothing. She had nothing. But then she remembered the jar of oil. Elisha told her to bang on the doors of her neighbors and strangers and collect every pot or vase or pitcher she found and start pouring out that precious jar. She did as she was told, gathering every vessel she could. And as each one was filled, her sons would bring her another and another, filling far more vessels than she'd ever need. And then, finally, there weren't any jars left to bring. And that is when her tiny jar poured its last drop. How often is God's goodness to us only limited by the vessels we've given Him to fill? I've sometimes held out the tiniest jar and feebly asked, fill this? I've been afraid to bang on any more doors, to find any more vessels, to chase down any more opportunities, afraid I'll be disappointed. Because we're convinced that if something is good and beautiful, it can't also be abundant. But God's goodness is like an entire orchard full of apples. It's like a jar that just keeps pouring. What if, instead of worrying that God's goodness might run out, we started worrying about whether or not we could find enough vessels to contain it? What if we set our families in front of Him, our church in front of Him? What if we set out our businesses in front of Him and our cities? What if we set out our hopes and dreams and aspirations? What if we asked Him to fill our relationships and our neighborhood and our nation? What if we set out even the most mismatched, cracked, and broken vessels of our lives and asked, will you fill this too? Will you? Please, will you fill this too?